Richmond, 1855, was a city of contradictions. Its streets were cobbled and worn, lined with brick buildings whose facades bore the weight of commerce, wealth, and social prestige. Smoke from chimneys mingled with the summer heat, giving the air a heavy, almost tangible presence. Merchants shouted from the sidewalks, calling attention to fine fabrics, livestock, and household wares, while planters, with their wide-brimmed hats and polished boots, moved with deliberate authority, as if every step confirmed their dominion over the city and its hinterlands. Yet beneath the visible order, the city throbbed with tension, the institution of slavery that underpinned. Richmond's wealth was increasingly challenged by whispers of freedom and rebellion, and the streets carried an undercurrent of fear and fascination that was almost palpable. On one particular day, a crowd gathered outside the sprawling auction house near the riverfront, drawn not by the promise of goods or livestock, but by a rumor that had spread like wildfire in taverns, markets, and drawing rooms. A man had arrived in Richmond whose beauty and presence were said to transcend anything the city had ever seen. He was called Elijah by the few who knew him, though his real name had been erased, swallowed by the ledger of human property that tracked souls as though they were nothing more than numbers. Elijah was unlike any man in the city. He was tall, his posture erect yet graceful, carrying an elegance that seemed innate rather than learned. His skin was a dark, lustrous mahogany, the color of rich earth after a rain, smooth and unblemished in a way that made one forget the cruelty that had been inflicted upon him. His hair, tightly coiled but impeccably kept, framed a face that combined strength and delicate beauty, a jawline, firm but not harsh, cheekbones sculpted yet softened by warmth, lips that were full but never unkind. But it was his eyes that drew everyone in, a deep, golden amber that seemed almost unnatural, shifting in light from warmth to intensity, as if they held centuries of memory and secrets too profound for casual conversation. The auction house was a vast, echoing room, its ceilings high and its walls lined with galleries where women, curious onlookers, and town dignitaries pressed themselves against the railing for a better view. The main floor was crowded with men in fine coats and hats, each vying for the chance to purchase a human being as if he were a fine horse or piece of land. There were whispers, some envious, some awed. "Have you seen him? They say he speaks 3 languages. No one has ever seen anyone like him." Elijah stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back, moving only when necessary. Yet the subtle tilt of his head, the slight furrow of his brow, made him appear fully aware of every gaze and every thought projected toward him. He was observing, always observing, storing every detail, every pattern of behavior, every whispered conversation, as if mentally cataloguing the absurd theater around him. Beneath the surface of his calm, Elijah carried memories that were sharp, painful, and vivid. He remembered a river in his childhood village, a river that moved slowly yet with unstoppable certainty, reflecting the sun in ripples of molten gold. His mother had sung beside its banks, her song soft and lilting, telling tales of ancestors who had survived and thrived long before anyone sought to enslave them. He remembered the warmth of her hands as she braided his hair, the way she would whisper his true name, the one stolen from him by the ledger and the auction block. Those memories were a lifeline, an invisible thread connecting him to a freedom that had been denied, but not extinguished. They reminded him of who he was and who he must still become. As the auction began, the room erupted with the guttural energy of commerce. The auctioneer's voice boomed, precise and commanding, calling out bids in rapid succession. Every time the hammer neared the table, a sense of finality threatened to pin Elijah like a butterfly under glass. Men leaned forward, estimating his value not as a human being, but as an investment. Some imagined the labor he could provide, others the prestige of owning someone considered extraordinary. Planters whispered strategies, consulting one another as if he were a rare artifact to be carefully acquired. Women in the galleries murmured among themselves, some captivated by his beauty, others unsettled by the intensity of his gaze. Children dared not approach. Yet when their eyes met his, they were met with a faint smile, small and fleeting, that seemed to carry warmth and reassurance, tiny acts of resistance against a world that sought to strip him of humanity. What made Elijah extraordinary was not only his appearance, but the intelligence and awareness that radiated from him. He had been trained in subtle observation, in memorizing accents and mannerisms, in knowing the difference between genuine authority and mere bluster. He understood the mechanics of the auction house, the patterns of the auctioneer, the way the gavel fell, the reactions of bidders when a particularly strong offer was made. He noticed details others overlooked, the faint tremor in a wealthy man's hand, the nervous glance between a pair of planters conspiring silently, the subtle exchange of coded gestures among the servants. These were all pieces in a puzzle, and Elijah had learned to read them with precision, storing the knowledge for when it might be needed. Yet even as he observed, he maintained a quiet dignity, a presence that commanded attention without force. There was a tension in the air, a strange combination of desire, fear, and curiosity. Some men bid recklessly, driven by the allure of owning a man who seemed to embody perfection. Others hesitated, unnerved by the way Elijah's gaze seemed to measure them in return, assessing character, weighing intentions, silently passing judgment. No one had seen anyone like him, and perhaps that was what frightened them most, the knowledge that his spirit remained untouched, untamed despite the chains he wore. The crowd's fascination became almost tangible as the bids climbed. Each raise of the paddle was met with murmurs, and the crowd's fascination became almost tangible as the bids climbed. Each raise of the paddle was met with murmurs and speculation. Some of the wealthiest men in the room, who had long believed themselves masters of fate, were caught off guard by a simple truth. Elijah was more than a possession. There was an air of mystery about him, a sense that he belonged to no one, not even the highest bidder. Even those accustomed to cruelty sensed it. This man could not be fully owned. As the gavel struck repeatedly, the room seemed to shrink around him. Yet Elijah remained composed. He recalled stories of men who had been broken by auctions, their spirits crushed under the weight of expectation and oppression. He vowed silently that he would not be among them. If the world saw him as property, he would play the part, but inside, he nurtured a quiet rebellion, a strategy that relied on patience, observation, and timing. By the end of the day, the auctioneer's gavel had chosen a buyer, a wealthy planter with a commanding presence and eyes sharp as razors. The crowd dispersed, leaving only murmurs and lingering impressions of a man who seemed too remarkable to be confined by chains. Elijah was led away, his posture unbroken, his gaze steady. Yet as he walked through the streets of Richmond, past taverns, markets, and the river that mirrored the sky, he began to plan. Each detail he had memorized, the layout of the city, the paths less traveled, the guards' routines, became a map in his mind. Freedom was not a distant dream. It was a possibility, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. Even as he was shown into the house of his new master, Elijah remained unbowed. He observed the patterns of servants and overseers, noted the weaknesses in routines, and catalogued every opportunity that might present itself. In the privacy of his quarters, he touched the wooden comb he had kept hidden, a small relic from his past, intricately carved with designs that reminded him of home. It was a tangible connection to a life stolen, a reminder of who he truly was. And in that quiet moment, he vowed that no chain, metal or social, would ever fully contain him. Elijah's story in Richmond was only beginning. The city, with all its wealth, power and cruelty, had never known a man like him. He carried with him a beauty that entranced, an intelligence that unsettled, and a spirit that refused to be broken. Those who thought they could claim him as property would soon discover that some souls were far too powerful to own. and that the most beautiful man ever auctioned in Richmond was also the most elusive, a mystery that would haunt the city long after the echoes of the gavel had faded. The sun had barely risen over Richmond the morning after the auction, casting a pale gold across the cobblestone streets. Yet the city already hummed with its usual bustle. Merchants opened their shops, children ran errands for their families, and carriage wheels clattered across the pavement. But beneath this ordinary rhythm, a storm lingered. It was a storm invisible to most, carried not by clouds or wind, but by the lingering presence of a man who refused to be bound. Elijah had been sold to a wealthy planter named Thomas Whitmore, a man known for both his wealth and his meticulous household. Whitmore's mansion sat on the outskirts of the city, overlooking the river that wound through Richmond like a dark, glinting ribbon. From the windows, one could watch the barges move slowly along the water, carrying goods, people, and occasionally, the stolen lives of men and women like Elijah. Whitmore was a man of careful habits. He walked the halls with measured steps, inspecting the conduct of his household staff as if they were pieces on a chessboard. He prided himself on efficiency, on order, and on control, especially over those he considered his property. Elijah's arrival was a curiosity, not only for his beauty, but for the whispers that had preceded him, tales of intelligence, charm, and subtle cunning that could unsettle even the most confident master. Whitmore eyed Elijah with a mix of pride and apprehension. He had purchased this man to display his wealth and prestige, to demonstrate that no cost was too great for perfection. Yet there was something about Elijah's composure, the quiet intensity of his amber eyes, that gnawed at Whitmore. Elijah, meanwhile, moved through the mansion with careful precision. He memorized every detail, the pattern of light through the windows, the position of furniture, the routines of the servants, and the timing of the overseer's rounds. Nothing escaped him, even the smallest gestures. A servant pausing a moment too long at a door, a slight hesitation in Whitmore's tone when, speaking to his wife, was stored in his mind. Each observation became part of a larger plan, a mental map of opportunity. He knew he was living in a gilded cage, yet within that cage he discovered cracks, openings through which he could slip when the time was right. Elijah's nights were restless, not with fear but with calculation. He traced the river in his mind, remembering the bends and currents, imagining the way it could carry him away under the cover of darkness. He recalled stories told by other men he had met in passing, whispers of safe houses, hidden paths, and sympathetic hands willing to help a man like him reach freedom. These were not fantasies. They were strategies, embedded in memory and observation, waiting for the exact moment to become reality. It was during these nights that another presence entered his world. Jonathan Whittaker. Unlike the majority of Richmond's citizens, Whittaker was not interested in wealth or status. His interests leaned toward the cause of freedom, and he had spent years moving quietly through cities and towns, seeking those who could help him further a clandestine mission. Whittaker had heard of Elijah long before the auction, drawn not merely by tales of his beauty but by the intelligence and subtlety that made him extraordinary. When he arrived in Richmond, he was careful, patient, and meticulous, moving like a shadow, observing the auction house from a distance, noting the way guards moved, and tracking Elijah's journey through the city. Whittaker first saw Elijah the evening after the sale. The mansion was quiet, the sun long gone behind the western horizon, leaving the river and the surrounding gardens bathed in silver moonlight. Whittaker crouched in the shadows beyond the wrought-iron gates, studying the movements inside. He had seen the way Elijah carried himself during the auction, the way he remained unbroken, undiminished, even when the gavel fell and the room erupted into applause or envy. He knew immediately that this man was different. Inside the mansion, Elijah moved with care, retrieving a small, intricately carved comb from beneath the folds of his clothing. It was a relic from a life that had been stolen, a token from his mother, and a reminder of the riverbanks where he had first learned to dream of freedom. As he traced his fingers over the patterns, a subtle plan began to take shape. He had memorized the routines of the guards and servants, the timing of meals, the shadows cast by the lanterns, and the weak points in the mansion's defenses. Each night he refined the plan, imagining every possible contingency, every trap, every obstacle that could prevent escape. Days passed, and Elijah's role in the household became routine in appearance, but was a constant exercise in observation and subtle manipulation. He learned the moods and habits of Whitmore's family, the subtle alliances among the servants, and the idiosyncrasies of those charged with watching him. He conversed sparingly with the household staff, speaking in measured tones, careful not to reveal the depth of his thoughts, but listening closely, memorizing names, faces, and patterns of speech. Every detail mattered. Every interaction became a piece of a puzzle that could one day lead him to freedom. Meanwhile, Jonathan Whittaker continued his surveillance. He moved quietly, blending into the city, listening to rumors, gathering intelligence. He knew that Elijah's situation was precarious. Richmond was heavily monitored, and Whitmore's wealth and influence made any overt attempt at rescue dangerous. Whittaker could not approach the mansion openly. He had to rely on patience, subtlety, and timing. He mapped the streets, noted the paths least observed, and waited for the precise moment when Elijah might be able to act. Tension mounted in the household. Whitmore, confident in his control, did not realize that the man he had purchased as an object was planning, observing and calculating every detail of escape. There was a delicate dance unfolding. Elijah feigned compliance while Whittaker prepared the way for intervention. Each movement precise, each moment critical. Servants who had once viewed Elijah with casual interest began to notice his quiet authority, the way he seemed to command respect without demanding it. Even Whitmore's family, charmed by his appearance and composure, could not see the subtle currents of defiance that flowed beneath his calm exterior. One night the opportunity presented itself. A storm rolled in from the west, bringing torrential rain, fierce winds, and the deafening roar of thunder. Windows rattled in their frames, and the gardens were transformed into a chaotic blur of wind-blown foliage. Elijah saw his chance. The storm provided both cover and confusion, masking sounds and movements, creating shadows where none had existed before. He moved silently through the mansion, retracing steps he had memorized over weeks, avoiding the guards and navigating corridors with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the path countless times in his mind. Whittaker, waiting in the shadows beyond the gates, observed the timing. He had coordinated with distant allies, invisible hands ready to guide Elijah to safety. Messages had been discreetly delivered, signals arranged, and contingencies planned. This was not a reckless escape. It was a meticulously orchestrated operation, dependent on observation, intelligence, and courage. Elijah reached the outer wall, feeling the chill of rain-soaked stone beneath his fingertips. He paused, listening to the storm, hearing the creak of the gate and the distant murmur of the river. Every detail he had memorized guided him. A loose brick here, a shadow there, the path to the riverbank beyond. Whittaker signaled with a subtle movement, and the first stage of escape began. With fluid precision, Elijah slipped into the darkness, moving like a shadow himself, invisible yet aware, every step bringing him closer to freedom and farther from the cage that had held him. As he disappeared into the night, the mansion stood silent, oblivious to the extraordinary events unfolding within and beyond its walls. Elijah had become not only a man of extraordinary beauty, but a figure of cunning, courage, and resilience. In the minds of those who had glimpsed him, he became a mystery, a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit, and a challenge to the very system that sought to claim him. Richmond would never forget the man who had vanished from its streets, a figure whose legend would grow in whispers and stories for years to come. The river that had once been a backdrop to Elijah's childhood now became his ally. The James River, swollen from the storm, roared with an almost vengeful energy, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and distant forests. Elijah had reached the bank just as the night swallowed the city behind him. The mansion and its guards were now distant shapes, their authority meaningless against the natural cloak of darkness and the fury of the storm. He paused briefly to breathe, feeling the raw power of the current, the chill of the rain against his skin, and the weight of possibility settling upon him. For the first time in months, perhaps for the first time in years, he felt the unmistakable sensation of hope. Jonathan Whitaker had coordinated the next stage of the plan with painstaking precision. Allies waited in hidden locations along the river, small boats tethered under fallen trees and camouflaged by brush, ready to ferry Elijah to safer ground. Whitaker's network of contacts, cultivated over years of clandestine operations, was ready to receive him, offering a series of safe houses, sympathetic households, and hidden routes that wove through Virginia's forests and mountains like an intricate web. These were not random acts of charity, but part of a system designed to defy the institution of slavery itself, to give men and women like Elijah a chance to reclaim their stolen lives. Elijah climbed into the small boat, with a careful grace that belied the adrenaline coursing through him. Whitaker, standing in the shadows on the far bank, signaled with subtle gestures learned through months of planning. The river carried them swiftly, masking their passage with the violent rhythm of rain and wind. Each stroke of the oar was precise, calculated, a measure of distance, speed and safety. Elijah felt the currents tug at him, testing his resolve. Yet he met them with equal determination. Behind him lay the world of chains and domination. Ahead, the unknown stretched in vast, terrifying, and exhilarating possibility. The journey through the night was more than physical. It was psychological. Elijah reflected on the cruelty he had endured, the beauty that had been admired yet commodified, the subtle and overt ways people had attempted to claim his mind, his body, and even his soul. He thought of his mother, of the river where she had sung, and of the stories she had told him of ancestors who had survived, horrors far greater than Richmond's auction houses. These memories were not just comfort, they were fuel. They reminded him that resilience was not merely about survival, it was about retaining humanity in a world that sought to strip it away. By the time dawn began to break, casting pale light over the riverbanks, Elijah had reached the first safe house in Whitaker's network. It was a modest cabin nestled among thick trees, nearly invisible to anyone passing by. The occupants, a family of free black citizens, greeted him with quiet efficiency, offering food, dry clothes, and a brief rest. They did not ask questions, for they knew the importance of discretion. Every second, every word could mean life or death. Elijah allowed himself a moment of gratitude, a rare and private smile, before continuing to plan the next stage. Freedom was not a single act. It was a continuous journey, requiring vigilance, cunning, and courage. News of Elijah's disappearance spread quickly in Richmond. The mansion was thrown into turmoil. Whitmore, furious and humiliated, dispatched guards to search the surrounding area, combing the riverbanks, the forests, and the roads with relentless determination. Rumors circulated. Some claimed they had seen a dark figure slipping through the trees. Others, that a man matching Elijah's description had been spotted in a distant town. Yet despite all efforts, he remained elusive, a ghost in the night, a living enigma whose beauty and intelligence had allowed him to escape, not just chains, but the very system that had sought to contain him. Elijah's journey continued over weeks and months, moving from safe house to safe house, guided by Whitaker's network. Each location offered not only physical refuge, but also knowledge, maps, contacts, and advice on avoiding patrols and bounty hunters. Along the way, Elijah encountered others fleeing oppression, men and women whose stories mirrored his own. He shared what he knew, guiding them through forests, teaching them to move silently, to observe carefully, and to trust only when discretion had been verified. In these moments, Elijah's role evolved. He was no longer merely a fugitive. He became a mentor, a beacon, a living embodiment of defiance against the institution that sought to dehumanize him. In towns and villages along the route, whispers of Elijah grew into legend. People spoke of the most beautiful man they had ever seen, a man whose presence commanded attention and whose intelligence seemed almost supernatural. Some claimed he had vanished into thin air. Others insisted he could move without being seen, that he had become one with the shadows. These stories spread quietly, a mixture of awe, fear, and admiration, reaching even those who had never glimpsed him in person. The legend of Elijah became a tool in itself, inspiring courage in the oppressed and caution in the oppressors. Eventually, Elijah reached the northern states, where slavery had been abolished. He settled in a community that valued not the color of his skin, but the strength of his character, the depth of his intelligence, and the courage he had demonstrated. Yet even in freedom, he could not fully escape the weight of the past. Memories of Richmond, the auction, and the men who had attempted to claim him remained vivid, shaping his understanding of justice, humanity, and resilience. He became involved in efforts to assist others still trapped in bondage, offering guidance, resources, and the lessons he had learned from his own extraordinary journey. Elijah's story persisted long after he disappeared from public view. Historians and chroniclers, piecing together letters, diaries, and eyewitness accounts, struggled to capture the full measure of the man who had been auctioned as property, yet lived as a symbol of defiance. Some accounts focused on his beauty, describing his skin, eyes, and presence as almost otherworldly. Others emphasized his intelligence, his strategic mind, and his ability to inspire courage in others. Still, all accounts shared a common thread. Elijah was more than a man. He was a challenge to the systems of oppression, a living testament to the resilience of those who refused to be reduced to mere property. Generations later, the tale of Elijah, the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in Richmond, remained a paradox of human history. He was remembered for his outward beauty, yes, but more importantly for the indomitable spirit that allowed him to transcend the cruelty of his circumstances. His life became a quiet but potent force, a narrative passed down in whispers, in letters, in oral histories, reminding future generations that freedom is never given. It is claimed through courage, intelligence, and unwavering will. Elijah's journey from Richmond to freedom was more than a personal triumph. It was a testament to the enduring power of hope. Each step he had taken, each obstacle he had overcome, each life he had touched along the way, built a legacy that no ledger, no auction block, and no system of oppression could erase. His story, etched into the memory of the land and its people, became an emblem of resilience, beauty, and defiance, a reminder that some souls, no matter how constrained by circumstance, cannot be owned, cannot be silenced, and cannot be forgotten. Even as the years passed, the name Elijah evoked awe, mystery, and reverence. Richmond, once the site of his commodification, remembered him as a ghostly figure whose beauty and cunning defied containment. His escape inspired countless others. His legend fueled hope in those still struggling under oppression, and his life served as a beacon, a powerful affirmation that freedom is not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination. In the end, Elijah's story was more than a tale of escape. It was a celebration of the human spirit's ability to triumph against impossible odds, to transform suffering into strategy, and to turn beauty and intellect into instruments of liberation.